The northwestern wind howled through Tokyo like a banshee on that frozen March night. Wooden houses shuddered under its force. Paper walls rattled like nervous prayers. Above the sleeping city, stars blazed with unnatural clarity against the black sky. Something felt different about this night. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Young Katsumoto broke through ice covering the neighborhood water tanks. His wooden clogs cracked the frozen surface with sounds like rifle shots. The boy moved with practiced efficiency. Every night for months, this same ritual. Check the pumps. Test the water flow. Prepare for the bombs that might fall. His father watched from nearby. The man's voice carried tension that months of nightly drills couldn't ease. Again, Katsumoto. Check the mechanism one more time. The imperial chrysanthemum gleamed on their single neighborhood pump. This lone defense against American firebombs. Around them, neighbors emerged from their homes. Each family clutched bamboo spears. They held these simple weapons with reverence, like ancient samurai wielding sacred swords. Mrs. Tanaka demonstrated proper spear technique to her young daughter. The woman's movements were precise, deliberate, deadly serious. Push hard into the belly, Kiko-chan. American soldiers are weak there. 6 blocks away, little Shizuko Nishio arranged delicate paper flowers. Tomorrow would bring her birthday celebration. Her mother hummed softly while folding origami cranes. Make a wish, little bird. These would be the final words between mother and daughter. Radio static crackled through the cold air. The announcer's voice carried false confidence. Enemy formations changing course southward. Moving away from the capital. Citizens may rest peacefully tonight, but high above their heads, death circled on silver wings. 334 B-29 bombers moved through the darkness. These weren't the heavily armored fortresses Tokyo had learned to fear. General Curtis LeMay had stripped away their guns, removed their armor plating, eliminated their ammunition. Every available space now held something far more terrible. 1,265 tons of jellied gasoline waited in their bomb bays. Weapons specifically designed to turn wooden cities into crematoriums. Librarian Hashimoto Yoshiko organized her fire brigade equipment one final time. Leather buckets seemed pitifully small under the vast starlit sky. Sand containers offered meager protection. Canvas beaters appeared helpless against the approaching storm. She had no idea that American scientists had spent months perfecting their city-burning techniques. Desert test sites in Utah held perfect replicas of Japanese neighborhoods. American engineers burned them repeatedly. They timed flame spread rates, measured peak temperatures, calculated exactly how much napalm would create unstoppable infernos. The wind gusted stronger now. Windows rattled violently. Loose roof tiles clattered into narrow streets below. Perfect conditions for firestorm. Bone-dry wooden structures. Hurricane-force gusts from the northwest. Humidity so low that static electricity sparked between Katsumoto's fingers. A neighbor pointed skyward. Look there. The first Pathfinder planes. High above, lead bombers began dropping their markers. Not explosive bombs, something that fell like silvery Christmas tinsel, creating a giant burning cross across Tokyo's heart, the most densely populated district on Earth. 75,000 people per square mile. 750,000 souls packed into 12 square miles of paper and wood. How do you defend a city built to burn? The answer would come within minutes. What Tokyo's citizens couldn't understand was their role as test subjects. The most calculated civilian destruction in human history was about to begin. In the Pentagon War Room, 6,000 miles away, General Curtis LeMay studied weather reports. The 40-year-old commander had abandoned everything military doctrine taught about precision bombing. High-altitude daylight raids targeting factories proved useless. Japanese war production had scattered into thousands of tiny workshops. These hid within civilian neighborhoods. Armored bombers flying defensive formations wasted resources. Japanese night fighters were nearly blind. Their radar remained primitive. Their fuel supplies ran critically low. LeMay's radical gamble stripped bombers naked. Fly them low and fast. Burn Japan's cities to ash with incendiary weapons. Turn entire neighborhoods into crematoriums. "We're going to burn them out," he told his staff officers. "Tokyo is a paper city. We're going to make it disappear." Back in Tokyo, safety felt absolute. Young Katsumoto practiced elementary school fire drill routines. 30 children formed bucket brigades. They passed water hand to hand, recited patriotic slogans with innocent conviction. "Japanese spirit will overcome American material," their teacher proclaimed. She had no knowledge of American material advances. Napalm formulated to stick to human skin. Jellied gasoline that burned underwater. Weapons that generated temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Tokyo Fire Department statistics read like a death sentence disguised as preparation. 8,000 firefighters for nearly 4 million people. Exactly 3 extension ladders for the entire capital. 17 fire stations covering 220 square miles. Water pressure so low that hoses barely reached second-story windows. Government propaganda machines churned out confidence. Superior Japanese fighting spirit would triumph over American cowardice. This faith would prove tragically misplaced. At 11:30 p.m., radio warnings began. They sounded almost routine. Enemy formations approaching from southeast. Estimated 30 aircraft. Maintain fire watch procedures. Citizens checked their preparations one final time. Sand buckets filled. Water barrels topped off. Bamboo fire beaters within arm's reach. Children's escape routes memorized and practiced. American intelligence officers had mapped every neighborhood detail. Aerial photographs revealed street widths, too narrow for effective fire breaks. Construction surveys identified building materials, traditional wooden frames with paper walls, structures designed to flex during earthquakes, helpless against sustained heat. Weather analyses predicted wind patterns. Small fires would become citywide conflagrations. Hashimoto Yoshiko gathered her fire brigade volunteers, 15 housewives and elderly men, armed with wet towels and canvas beaters, tasked with defending 10 city blocks. "Remember," she instructed them, "incendiary bombs scatter burning pieces. We must move quickly from spot to spot. Prevent fires from joining together." Her instructions followed official doctrine. Based on facing traditional magnesium incendiaries, small contained fires that trained civilians could actually extinguish. But approaching weapons weren't traditional incendiaries. Revolutionary M69 cluster bombs packed 38 separate napalm canisters each, designed to spread liquid fire across football field-sized areas. Single cluster bombs created fires so intense they generated their own weather. Tornado-force winds hurled burning debris for miles. Temperatures turned asphalt streets into flowing tar rivers. At midnight exactly, little Shizuko woke to her mother's gentle shaking. "Put on your padded air raid clothes, little bird." The sirens might sound tonight. Shizuko dressed sleepily in thick cotton jacket and pants, clothing designed to protect against bomb fragments. Garments that would become her funeral shroud when soaked with napalm and ignited by radiant heat. Psychological preparation ran deeper than physical defenses. For months, Japanese civilians had been conditioned to view American bombing as tests of national character. Surrender remained unthinkable. Retreat meant shame. The emperor's subjects would fight with bamboo spears if necessary, preferring death to dishonor. This cultural programming would trap hundreds of thousands in the coming inferno. Absolute refusal to flee would seal their fate. Across the Pacific, B-29 crews received final briefings. These weren't typical military targets, not aircraft factories or steel mills. Tonight's target zone contained apartment buildings, schools, neighborhood temples, market streets where children bought candy, where elderly couples sold handmade crafts. Some crews wrestled with moral implications. Others focused on strategic necessity. Break Japanese civilian morale before invasion costs 1 million American lives. At 12:10 a.m. on March 10th, Pathfinder B-29s crossed Tokyo Bay. Their target contained 750,000 people sleeping in wooden houses built generations ago, when fire was mankind's greatest fear, when water was considered ultimate protection. Young Katsumoto stood at his window. Searchlights swept the sky like grasping fingers. The air felt electric with anticipation, charged like summer thunderstorms. But this storm wouldn't bring rain. It would bring liquid fire falling like snow, burning rivers that boiled human flesh, temperatures hot enough to melt fire engines racing toward impossible battles. Silver sharks circled overhead. Pathfinders took position. Wind conditions were perfect. Tokyo was about to learn what happens when medieval defenses meet industrial warfare. At 12:15 a.m., Pathfinder B-29s released their markers. The night sky erupted in impossible beauty. Incendiary clusters fell like silvery waterfalls. Each bomb split open to scatter brilliant white-hot canisters through darkness. From his window, young Katsumoto watched in amazement. What looked like Christmas tinsel drifted down through crisp March air, sparkling and glittering as it fell toward sleeping neighborhoods below. "It's beautiful," whispered his little sister, pressing her face against cold glass. First, napalm canisters struck wooden rooftops with soft thuds, then exploded in fountains of jellied fire, spreading like spilled paint across traditional tile surfaces. Within seconds, 38 separate fires bloomed from each cluster bomb, creating a giant burning cross that marked the target zone. For massive bomber formations still approaching from southeast. Mrs. Tanaka ran into the street clutching her bamboo spear, shouting neighborhood fire drill commands. Small fires first. Prevent them from joining. But these weren't small fires. Each napalm canister spread liquid flame across areas 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. The bamboo spear ignited in her hands like a match. Hashimoto Yoshiko raced toward the library with her fire brigade. Canvas beaters and leather buckets, suddenly pathetic against fires that towered 30 feet into the air, generated heat waves visible in darkness. Wet towels around their faces began steaming. Then, smoking, as radiant temperatures climbed toward 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt copper. Hot enough to turn water into superheated steam. Hot enough to ignite human clothing from heat alone. "The water!" Yoshiko screamed, pointing toward their neighborhood fire defense tank. When she reached the concrete reservoir, she discovered water was boiling, actually boiling from radiant heat of surrounding fires. Steam rose from the surface like fog. When she dipped her leather bucket, it came up filled with water too hot to touch. At 12:30 a.m., main bomber formations arrived. 300 B-29s flying so low that Katsumoto could see individual crew members in cockpit windows. One superfortress passed directly overhead. So close he could hit it with thrown stones if he had superhuman strength. The plane's silver fuselage reflected growing fires below, making it look like a flying mirror carrying captured pieces of hell. The bomber crew later described turbulence from fires below. The aircraft bounced around like a ping-pong ball. Thermal updrafts were so violent they could barely control the plane. Looking down was like staring into the mouth of a blast furnace. For people trapped in that furnace, the experience defied description. 6-year-old Shizuko ran hand in hand with her mother toward the designated evacuation zone, a school playground that officials promised would serve as a firebreak. When they arrived, they found 200 other families crowded into small space, all believing the same official lie. Open ground means safety. Napalm doesn't recognize safe zones. Cluster bombs fell directly into the playground, turning the entire area into a lake of liquid fire. Shizuko watched her mother's padded air raid clothes ignite spontaneously from heat, saw other children from her kindergarten class running in circles with their hair on fire, screaming for parents who were themselves human torches stumbling through blazing night. Later, rescue workers found skeletal remains of all 20 children from Shizuko's class melted together in a single mass of fused bone and metal. Belt buckles, shoe eyelets, and school badges created a grotesque sculpture of childhood destroyed. "Mother?" Shizuko called into the flames, but there was no answer except the roar of fire consuming everything that once felt permanent and safe. At 1 a.m., fires began creating their own weather system. Superheated air rose so rapidly it formed tornado-force downdrafts, sucking burning debris into spiral columns hundreds of feet high. Telephone poles snapped like twigs in winds exceeding hurricane strength. Roof tiles flew through air like deadly projectiles. Fire itself began making sounds no human had ever heard. A deep, rumbling moan that came from Earth itself, as underground gas lines exploded and sewer systems vaporized. Young Katsumoto's family attempted their planned escape route. Running toward the Sumida River, where officials promised water would provide natural protection. When they reached the riverbank, they discovered water was literally boiling. Bodies floated in current like logs, not corpses, but people who jumped in seeking relief and were cooked alive as water temperature rose above 180 degrees. "We have to cross," Katsumoto's father decided, looking at flames advancing behind them. "It's our only chance." His mother stopped, pulled down her pants, and urinated in the street. "Sorry," she told her shocked children. "It's not easy running with a full bladder, and we may not get another chance." They never reached the other side. The metal bridge they were crossing became too hot to touch, then began glowing red like a giant heating element. Katsumoto's father's shoes melted to bridge surface. His mother's hair ignited from radiant heat before any flame touched her. Only Katsumoto survived, pulled from water by a stranger who died saving him, leaving the 12-year-old alone in a world that no longer made sense. At 1:30 a.m., Tokyo Fire Department's desperate counterattack began and ended simultaneously. Fire engines raced toward blazes with sirens wailing. But trucks themselves became victims when their tires melted. Their fuel tanks exploded. Their crews died at their posts. Of 125 firefighters who responded to the emergency, not one survived. Their engines became metal monuments scattered throughout burning district, twisted sculptures commemorating futility of fighting industrial warfare with industrial-age equipment. Hashimoto Yoshiko made one final attempt to save the library. The building contained her life's work and her neighborhood's cultural memory. She soaked herself in boiling water from fire tank. wrapped wet cloth around her face, charged into burning building to rescue what books she could carry. Inside, she discovered that paper burns differently when air temperature exceeds 1,000 degrees. Books don't catch fire, they simply vanish, dissolving into ash so fine it floats away like gray snow. Centuries of Japanese literature disappeared. Children's stories vanished. Family photographs and handwritten letters became part of black clouds that blocked out stars. She never made it back outside. Later, investigators found her remains in library entrance. Her body curled around a single book, a collection of children's poetry she died trying to save. At 2 a.m., firestorm reached full intensity. Temperatures in core burn zones exceeded those inside steel blast furnaces. Glass windows didn't just break. They melted and flowed like water down building walls. Metal fire escapes glowed cherry red, then white hot, then collapsed into pools of molten steel. Human bodies didn't just burn. They were consumed so completely that only shadows remained, burned into concrete sidewalks like negative photographs. Most horrifying discovery came at dawn. In designated safety evacuation zones, rescue workers found piles of bodies stacked 2 meters high. Families who followed official instructions and died together in spaces supposed to protect them. Men, women, children, and elderly grandparents melted into single masses of fused flesh and bone. Their final act being to hold each other as fire consumed everything they had ever loved. By 3 a.m., 16 square miles of Tokyo had simply ceased to exist. Not damaged, erased. Where neighborhoods stood 6 hours earlier, only ash plains remained, broken by twisted metal skeletons of buildings. Occasional concrete foundations marked where someone's home used to be. 100,000 people were dead. 1 million were homeless. In morning light, survivors would discover their bamboo spears had become piles of charcoal. Their water guns had melted into abstract sculptures. Their faith in traditional defenses had been burned away as completely as their city. Silver sharks finished feeding. Sky no longer rained fire. But for survivors, burning would never stop. Dawn broke over a landscape resembling an alien planet's surface. Where Tokyo's most densely populated neighborhoods stood 12 hours earlier, only ash plains stretched to horizon, broken by black skeletons of concrete buildings. Occasional metal water tanks twisted into abstract sculptures by heat exceeding steel's melting point. 12-year-old Katsumoto wandered through streets he no longer recognized, calling for family in a voice that echoed off empty foundations. His neighbors' houses had vanished so completely that only rectangular patches of ash marked where families lived for generations. Bamboo spears they clutched so proudly now formed small piles of charcoal. Fire defense water tanks filled with gray sludge that was once human beings. But Katsumoto survives to become something extraordinary. A man who dedicates his life to preserving memories of those who didn't. For 80 years, he collects survivor testimonies, becomes an award-winning writer whose books ensure voices of March 10th never fade to silence. People must know what this was like, he writes decades later. Not just statistics, but human faces, individual stories, children who never came home. 6-year-old Shizuko emerges as sole survivor of her kindergarten class, found 3 days later wandering in a daze through ash-covered ruins of her neighborhood. She carries trauma for the rest of her life, but also becomes a living bridge between historical horror and modern warning. In 2022, at age 83, she watches news footage of Ukrainian children sheltering from Russian bombs. Whispers, "This is me. That little girl crying in the shelter. This is me in 1945. Immediate strategic impact of Operation Meeting House exceeds every expectation. Japanese civilian morale doesn't just crack, it shatters completely. Post-war surveys reveal 70% of Tokyo residents knew the war was lost after the firebombing. Though they dared not speak such treasonous thoughts aloud, General LeMay's gamble worked. Breaking civilian will proves more effective than destroying military targets, but human cost creates ripples extending far beyond strategic victory. Families like the Suzukis spend decades searching for missing children who simply vanished in flames. 22 years after bombing, Suzuki Shizuko finally discovers his wife and daughter's remains. Not bodies, but skeletal fragments mixed with melted metal in what used to be their neighborhood temple. "I never stopped looking," he tells investigators. "Every time workers dug up old foundations, I would go see if they had found my family." Tokyo firebombing demonstrates something terrifying about modern warfare: complete erasure of distinction between military and civilian targets. Unlike atomic bombs that would follow, which at least targeted cities with military significance, Operation Meeting House deliberately targets most densely populated residential areas. Specifically because they contain the most civilians. Strategy succeeds so well, it becomes template for destroying 66 other Japanese cities before war's end. Yet, for decades, this horror remains hidden in historical shadow. No memorials commemorate 100,000 civilians who died in a single night. More than were killed at Hiroshima. No government compensation acknowledges survivors' suffering. No international tribunal questions whether burning residential neighborhoods constitutes war crimes. Firebombing victims become forgotten casualties of necessary victory. Today, as drone warfare and urban combat create new forms of civilian targeting, lessons of March 10, 1945 take on urgent relevance. Modern military planners study LeMay's tactics not as historical curiosities, but as proven methods for breaking enemy morale through terror. Ethical questions raised by Operation Meeting House remain as controversial today as 80 years ago. When does military necessity justify targeting civilians? How do we balance strategic effectiveness against human cost? Most powerful legacy lives in voices of survivors like Shizuko Nishio, who transform personal trauma into universal warning. When she looks at model incendiary bombs in museum displays, her hands still shake. When she sees images of modern urban warfare, she sees her 6-year-old self running through streets that burned like hell itself. "I was just a little girl who wanted to celebrate her birthday," she reflects. But war doesn't care about birthdays or children or families who just want to live in peace. That's why people must remember, not just dates or numbers, but what it felt like to be human in those flames. Remember their names. Remember their faces. Remember that behind every strategic victory lie real people who loved, laughed, and dreamed before sky rained fire and changed everything forever.